the city provide housing was in the agreement to settle move away from the art gallery?
So,
let me get you looking at her when you ask her a question.
could you repeat the question?
I just want a sense of how important the promise from the city to provide housing for people was in the decision by Occupy to give up the protest.
How important it was for them to provide housing? Well, I think it was of grave importance because we have 13 members of Occupy Vancouver, including myself and my husband, who are technically homeless. Now, I'm very lucky that the community of Occupy itself has stepped up. I'm able to spend some time on somebody's couch right now. But the fact remains that I do not have a place to call my own because of the high prices of Vancouver housing, as well as the difficulty, the unexpected difficulty of finding proper full-time employment. The Occupy's decision to end the encampment, when the injunction came through, was simply a matter of us insisting that we remain peaceful protest. We do not agree with the injunction or the Supreme Court decision, and I think that it's very, very important to realize that distinction, that we left because we wanted to remain peaceful. The fact is that the city failed in its commitment to house the people who needed housing, which has left members of our community out in the cold, and also members of the greater Vancouver community are being left out in the cold this Christmas.
So what are the challenges that you're having in securing a place?
Where were you
before Occupy?
I came to Vancouver shortly before Occupy started, and I was living in a hotel before I came down to the encampment. And at the encampment, I found a community base, I found support, I found a steady source of food and community medical support. When I found out I was pregnant, I had a network right there on site to help me. There was a midwife, there were several doulas on site that I was able to come and get into contact with. Fortunately, when the encampment ended, all of those resources became much harder for me to access, much more difficult for me to access. And so now I'm trying to play catch up by finding a midwife in the area, since the midwife who was on site was actually from Abbotsford. It's been difficult in the fact that suddenly the resources that I became reliant on are now not as easily accessible. Like I said, through the encampment, through the community we had, I'm able to have a warm place to stay, a warm place to sleep. But unfortunately, not everybody was so lucky. It's a strain on members of the Occupy community to be providing housing. They're providing their couches and for members of Occupy Vancouver who are not housed. And now the city is failing even more so by cutting funding to shelters and cutting funding to emergency winter shelters. So even more people are now being left out in the cold, and we think that's just simply outrageous.
I've heard many people who were sympathetic with your cause say that your strategy might have been better if instead of having tents there all the time, that you tried to do weekly rallies and marches and keep drawing large numbers of people from all demographics, as opposed to obviously only the diehards are going to be able to be tented out on the art gallery. What do you think, looking back now, on your strategy to try to achieve very big long-term changes in society?
Well, of course, we are still in the midst of that, and that's not stopping anytime soon. The kickoff to this movement that, of course, sprang out of the Occupy Wall Street movement was in solidarity with the idea that in order to bring these issues to the public's attention, you need to occupy space. And the proof is, we're talking about this. The proof is, we've stopped talking about austerity measures, we've stopped talking about stimulating the economy by cutting taxes to corporations, and people are starting to ask themselves, we have a moral vision for our society. What is it? What should we be doing? Not how can we react to these kind of drastic cuts in services, but what kind of world do we want to live in? And what the tents did was they put that front and center every single day.
But many people would say that the people weren't talking about those issues, but they were talking about the tents, the overdoses in other cities. It became about, oh, people are defecating in our parks. So it seemed to kind of take the conversation just about that and not about any of these issues.
Well, what it did was enable the people who either have a vested interest in continuing this kind of exploitation, it handed them a bit of a stick to beat us with. So we were there every day discussing politics, but what you saw was skirmishes with people on the outskirts. What you saw were, you know, these sort of these cynically generated concerns about our health and safety, this massive over-policing. We were still doing work constantly. We were distracted by having to figure out what we were doing existing down there. But without the tents, we did not have the community to support those kind of discussions. When you're gathered with people from all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum, especially in Vancouver, which really has very little true public space, everywhere you go, you need to pay for something. You know, and we absolutely reject the notion that there are such things as legitimate protesters and illegitimate protesters, because people are homeless, that somehow they have no right to protest the system that has essentially stacked the deck from day one. So what that space provided was food, so no one had to go searching for food all the time. Medical tent was there to take care of us. We generated a community that allowed us to look at the issues. It's unfortunate that many people focused on the tents as some kind of shibboleth, or this phantom in the middle of downtown taking up this space that people were, you know, desperate to use. And it's especially unfortunate because no one is using that space. I walk through there every day. I see no one.
You talk about over-policing, yet there were some real fire hazards and fire concerns that the fire chief brought up, concerns that Occupy protesters agreed with. And, you know, there's a real concern that that could have ended very horribly. How can you say that, you know, there was over-policing, or in some cases it wasn't warranted, when there were real fire concerns?
Well, I think what we have to do is separate these concepts out. Over-policing refers to the police presence. Fire and safety was something we were dealing with every single day. There was a real sense from our meetings with the city that it really wasn't about fire safety. We met with them again and again as they tried to get us off the Vancouver Art Gallery. They offered trailers, they offered warehouse space, and when we said, no, we're staying, we're part of the Occupy movement, this is what we do, that's when the vice really started to tighten around these, you know, 3 feet and no less, and these very strict, you know, rulers came out and that sort of thing. So to a lot of our minds, that was a fairly cynical manipulation of these concerns for our health. As regards to the policing costs, $50,000, $70,000 for the first day for a SWAT team on standby. Police overtime was out of control, and most of those costs were incurred in the first weekend before anybody had any idea of what was going to happen. So the city, caught with its pants down in its mishandling of the Stanley Cup riots, overreacted to our peaceful protest to talk about some really important stuff. Corporate welfare is out of control in this country, in the Western world, and it's billions of dollars. You know, and we're talking about the cost of free speech in downtown Vancouver. I've heard commentators in the Vancouver media scene get extremely angry at the fact that free speech ever has a price tag. And you know, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid in a Canadian elementary school, we were taught that the Canadian right to free speech is one of the things that makes us great.
Do you regret leaving the art gallery?
I think we all have some mixed feelings about it. You know, we made a commitment to be peaceful. The rhetoric coming out of the NPA campaign at that time was implicitly violent. Suzanne Anton trying to manipulate the Occupy Vancouver cause to get some traction against the incumbent, made reference to how they would never have allowed the tents to go up. She wouldn't answer any further questions about that, but basic logic tells you that if tents are up and they come in to take them down and we're not going anywhere, she's advocating violence.
Is the movement considering going back to the art gallery or establishing a tent camp somewhere else in the city?
I believe the movement as a whole is taking this winter to think about this sort of thing. You know, we've made our point, I think, at this point. People are aware of us. We've really brought a lot of attention. We've changed the national conversation. What we need to do now is consolidate our processes, work together. We have to be ready for the next, you know, whatever's coming next, we have to be ready for it. What I have heard from the Occupy Wall Street movement is that this spring is going to be an explosion of encampments and an explosion of political expression, and I believe we'll be part of that.
Do you feel you lose in touch with the public? With your movement there? Because after you left the art gallery, you went to Woodland Park. The people that you're representing said, not in our neighborhood. And then you went to the Port of Vancouver. The BCC Fed says, we don't support what they're doing here.
Sure. Actually, I'm really happy to clear up a couple of these misconceptions. So in the commercial drive at Grandview Park, what a couple of members of the Friends of Grandview Park Association, who are fairly controversial in that neighborhood as encroaching gentrification, made a lot of noise. There were two of them. We received so much support from that neighborhood and apologies because so many people there support us. It's a lower income neighborhood. They know these are real problems. We get unbelievable amount of support. Every time I wear this button, you know, you walk down the street, people want to know, what are we doing? How are things going? What do you guys need? You know, when we were in the art gallery, people would come by and hand hundreds to me that I would have to walk over to the donation tent because I didn't want to, you know, take money. But people are busy. They have 2 jobs. They have kids. They don't have the luxury of time. I work full time, but I don't have a family. So I spend every moment I'm not working for Occupy Vancouver. But we are extremely aware of the fact that every single one of us in this movement represents at least 1,000, if not more, people who wish they could be here and wish they could be involved.
BC Federation of Labour said that they still support the movement, but not the tactics.
Jim Sinclair has been in meetings with us numerous times. I think what we're seeing here is, you know, the natural discussion that results when old-style tactics that have kind of hardened into a bureaucratic procedure meet new. So a lot of people in this movement are very young. Unionism has been around for quite a while, has become fairly standardized, and some people see it as merely the shadow side of capitalism. So it works for the rights of the workers, but we're worried about the entire system right now. So I don't anticipate the unions coming on board with some of our tactics anytime soon, and I think that's great. They can work their way, we can work our way, and as much as possible, we can work together. And the more people who can work together, the better we're going to be able to get corporate money out of elections,
So
for example.
Can you break down, you say that you're saving the city, you saved the city money over the 37 days. Can you break that down a little bit in terms of what that looks like? I know you said housing 30 people for 37 days.
Okay, so that calculation is based on $83 per mat, and these are mats that are available in shelter space in Vancouver. As I said, while we were running, there was absolutely no mats available, so it was the street or nothing. But taking the calculation that $83 per night for 37 nights, for 30 people out of the 80 to 120 who were sleeping there, who had nowhere else to go, I think we ended up at about $95,000 worth of housing services. Now, if the city had a commitment to keep people off the street in the cold, that would have been money directly that we were saving them. As it was, we were living up to their commitment to make Vancouver a livable city for everyone.
I mean, shelter space is, though, a difficult topic. I mean, I spoke to people early December saying they had space available. You know, sometimes up to 15 beds a night in Vancouver. We're seeing, even end of November, some shelters saying they were operating at about 80%.
Right, they opened emergency spaces after the weather got colder. So it drops to a certain temperature, and that forces the opening of more spaces. But even this week we've seen, I believe it's the First Gospel Mission is announcing that it's closing its doors. Funding has been cut. All of those people are going to be on the street. That's not acceptable to us.
So that was $90,000 for housing.
That was rough, and these are conservative estimates by a public policy grad student. The medical services was a big one. We, you know, in socialized medicine, we don't really get bills like they do in the States, so it's hard to actually remember how much medical care costs. We had doctors, registered nurses, medics providing a range of services from for occupiers and for people off the street. This was a 24-hour clinic, essentially, that anyone could use. And serious infections, pneumonia, like real issues that people should have probably had a family doctor for. But we have a family doctor shortage in this province, and clinics that close early at night. So going on an approximately $180 per visit for non-MSP covered visits, where the Crossroads Clinic estimates the same cost is to taxpayers when covered by MSP. So just think about that for a moment. When you go to the doctor, boom, $180. So we provided 100 visits per day to the medical tent for 37 days. So the cost of that saved the BC medical system $670,000. And again, very conservative estimate.
So then your issue then is with the amount of police presence that there was, and not so much, city staff that were coming by or fire officials. Is that correct?
In terms of how much the city spent on us, a lot of the city staff, they were great. They came, they chatted, they got overtime, which most of them were pretty happy about, and they just, they'd come and listen to us and roll their eyes occasionally about how long it took us to come to decisions and things. They were generally, they were there to observe, and they observed, but there was a lot of them to be observing. There were a lot of fire people on site to be observing. And if you take those costs out, the bulk was still there, which is the cost of over-policing, almost all of which was the first couple of days, which I believe the city has admitted, or even trumpeted in the election campaign when it was in their interest to do so, that costs dropped to about $1,000 a day.
You said the city hasn't yet provided housing to Occupy protesters, so does the city have all the information they need to contact those people and get them into housing?
When we left on the condition that housing would be provided for those who had nowhere to go, all of those forms were filled out, lists were given. Basically we've seen this, or I've been told, we've seen this in tent cities and tent encampments in Vancouver before, that really the guaranteed way to get shelter space in Vancouver is to form a tent city. That you can essentially jump the queue based on you're in people's face. They want you to go away. The unfortunate thing that we all, and it took a while for us to come to agreement on this, because we knew this was going to help our community members, but list for social housing and the list for shelter space is really long. And putting 30 people at the front of it bumps 30 people off the bottom, and those people need the services just as much. So everybody, feels okay about it, but we were really aware that this is a much bigger issue than our 30 fellow occupiers who had nowhere else to go.
Excellent.
Any other questions?
I'm gonna need your statement when everybody's done, because I was.
Yeah, no worries. We can redo it.
Can we get the
Sorry,
slides
I've
from
got
last?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Oh,
hold
sure.
on.
Okay, so I'm Sarah Beuhler, Sarah Beuhler. My name's on the press release and my number. Give me a call. This is Richard Porteous, Porteous. And this is Joy Bartlett, Joy, Joybartlett.